Fascinerende.
Er du sendt ut?
Jeg sendte
Jeg skal jobbe bak oss først.
Men den er mye bedre enn den.
Det der er meg.
Den andre bare
Men
ser ut
altså, jeg
som
har
på plass.
Erika der, ja. Closer. For den gamle.
Ja, jeg sier at det er på seksjonen. Ja, seksjonsarbeidet. Ja, greit. Jeg sendte deg på requisition perfect på sendte på norsk da.
So I studied first.
Det er dette her er Maren som jeg snakket om. Han jobber mye med det. Så dere må snakke.
I told them my goal advised me not to study. She said if you want to come see. Ja, så okay, let's work on it. Jeg har jobbet med det alltid, men det er først nå. Så det ja, nei, ikke noe.
Sånn.
Kan dere høre meg?
Fred er mye mer enn fred.
Ikke sant?
Right, welcome to this conversation that I'm very exciting to be able to organize today about participatory approaches. My name is Inger Brodal and I'll lead you through this conversation today. I work in the food section here in Norad. And why is the food section organizing this? It's a bit of a coincidence, but you know, sometimes you read a book and it changes your perspective. And that happened for me when I was looking for problem-solving methods within nutrition and food security. And I read this book by Monique and Jerry Sternin called The Positive Deviance Approach. And what struck me as I was reading that book was that this is not the narrative that I usually encounter. After all my years of working in development and humanitarian assistance, I've heard a lot about participatory approaches. I've heard about localization and local ownership, but I haven't still this approach, this resource-based approach of taking as your starting point that solutions are already existing in the society, and this genuinely participatory approach throughout the process. It wasn't something I felt like I had heard before, and I started to ask around, and a lot of people said the same thing. No, this is not really something we've heard before. So I started to ask around a bit with the help of my good colleagues Lutgard and Anita, and we've had a number of conversations with different people. And finally we encountered Arvind, who works at the University of Texas and who has previously worked with Monique and Jerry Sternin, who had written this book. So I was very pleased to make this connection. So we're going to have a program today where Arvind will give us a bit of a talk, of an introduction, and then we will have a panel afterwards. We're very lucky to have two senior people from Norwegian Church Aid and Save the Children Norway, who I will introduce later, along with my colleague Lutgard, who will sit on a panel. But before we go there, I would just like our what you call it, it's a policy director for human rights in our section for human rights and civil society, Liv, to frame this issue a bit within a human rights-based approach. Liv has worked for 20 years within human rights and with grassroots organizations, and we're very lucky to have her here at Norad with us. So Liv, please, if you would like to give a brief introduction.
So this is on? Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for that generous introduction, and hello everyone. So I've been asked to say just a few words about the importance of participation within a human rights-based approach, and why a human rights-based approach, and what does this mean? So all Norwegian development cooperation must promote a human rights-based development. This is stated in our guiding document and budget proposition 1S, which comes out every year. So this is sort of an overall obligation which we in Norad have a responsibility to follow up on. But what does it mean? And I'm not going to go into all the details because I only have 5 minutes. But a human rights-based approach to development fundamentally shifts the core mission of development from charity to an obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. And it does this by integrating human rights norms and principles into every area of development cooperation, including the process itself and in every thematic area of work, ideally. A human rights-based approach aims to empower people themselves, and especially those who are most marginalized, so that they can participate in policy formulation and hold accountable those who have an obligation to act. And the aim is to create sustainable development over time. A key principle is thus participation. Active, inclusive, free, and meaningful participation is both a means as well as an end in itself within a human rights-based approach. This is, of course, easier said than done. However, what it means is placing people at the center by empowering them to both identify and help address the main obstacles that impede them from enjoying their rights or having a better life. And this working principle calls for explicit and active engagement of affected communities in defining problems and finding solutions to solve them. Now, furthermore, the discussion around locally led development is not new in our sector. I think it's an ongoing discussion and maybe takes on different sort of words and descriptions over time, but it's there and it's not going away. And participation is crucial also here. There may, of course, be different views and interpretation of what participation actually means in a development context, and also when has real participation actually been achieved. How do we ensure that we've included or involved the right people? How do we know that the right people have been consulted? How do we ensure that no one is actually not left behind, which is also a guiding principle for all development cooperation here in Norway? And is the involvement real in the sense that it may actually influence the processes and the outcome? And when does participation become just a symbolic exercise that meets certain criteria on paper and looks very nice, but has no effect in practice and may actually then lead to harm? So linking this back to a human rights-based approach, participatory processes must be inclusive and they must also be non-discriminatory. In 2018, Norad developed a set of guiding principles for support to civil society. And these were, as I understand, it was before I joined Norad, but they were developed in an inclusive and consultative way. And among other things, these principles highlight the importance of inclusive and participatory decision-making processes and legitimacy. In this context, legitimacy means that to ensure locally relevant solutions, local needs and priorities must form the basis for the decisions on what to support and how that support should be organized, which is quite demanding and ambitious if you think about it in practical terms. These guiding principles are then closely linked to both a human rights-based approach and to the discussions on locally led development. Just to finish off, a few months ago, I was in 2024 already, so last year, I was asked to lead quite an interesting panel discussion at an event about what was called participatory grant making, organized by the Caribou Foundation and an organization called Tinker Tools. They help sort of people develop good and creative and new solutions and ideas. And this panel included a diverse group of participants ranging from civil society organizations to private foundations that actually give out sort of research funding. And each of these actors had developed their own approach to, in some way at least, ensure that participation from affected groups and communities were part of the grant-making process. And some of them had actually gone very far in giving away the power from the boardroom of an organization in Oslo to a community of organizations in the Global South. quite daring and quite an interesting approach. And what I took from this discussion is that participatory approaches may take different forms and shapes, but they need to be real. I mean, if you tell people they're supposed to be involved, they need to actually be allowed to be involved. And it cannot just be a tick the box exercise. Also, these processes may be very time and resource consuming, which is also challenging when we talk about efficiency. But they can be time and resource consuming if they are to be done properly. On the other hand, the results may be very rewarding in the long run. So I guess the idea is that participation leads to social change because people experience ownership and feel that they have a possibility of making an actual change in their own life. So I very much look forward to learning more about how participatory processes can actually be really successful. And thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks.
Thank you, Liv. I will then invite Arvind Singhal to come on stage. He's an academic with multiple years of experience, and mostly interesting to this conversation. He's worked with Jerry and Monique Sternin in the application of the participatory approach, and he's teaching a course at the University of Texas on this topic. So please, the floor is yours. And Arvind has already told me that this is no way to set up a meeting room to facilitate the conversation. So if you want to ask people to stand up and move their chairs, feel free.
Feel free. But it's okay to begin this way, because then we know what world we operate in and what the possibilities are. In the past 35, 40 years of me being a teacher, how many times I've entered a classroom to be seen as structured in rows and columns. And the first thing I do is I dismantle the classroom. And I dismantle it in a way so that each person can see each other. Absolutely critical. For those who are sitting on the back, you're mostly seeing the backs of other people, and what kind of a participation would we have if we begin with that base. So anyway, thank you, Inger, for the invitation, and Ludgard and Liv. And I don't have a speech or any prepared remarks. I'm going to work with the energy of what has been said. I was indeed very fortunate in the year 2004 at a university in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard. I was invited to a session where I happened to, by chance, meet the author of the book that sort of changed Inger's perspective. I just happened to meet the author. And we were sitting at the same banquet table. There was a banquet at Harvard. We were both happy to be there, although we were not in the program. And I asked him who he was, and he said, I'm Jerry Sternin. He's in his mid-60s. I'm Arvind Singhal. And he said, why are you here? I said, I don't know. But, they've invited me, and Harvard letterhead, and they were paying for my visit. And he said, same with me. So, 3 days. This was a workshop on health systems improvement. And there were, CEOs and very learned people, academics. On the second day, after lunch, each of us spontaneously got 5 minutes. And I was perceived at that time by some people, mistakenly, that I knew something about the diffusion of innovations. Yeah, classic evidence-based practices, And I had studied with somebody who's the godfather of innovation diffusion, Everett Rogers. Is very well known. He's the second most cited social scientist in the world. So I think that's the reason why I was there. And that's what I spoke about. What I had learned about the diffusion of social innovations, the spread, dissemination, translation, all those things that we talk about. And I'm glad I went first, because if Jerry had gone first, I probably, there was no need for me to give my 5-minute speech. And Jerry took 5 minutes to talk about this approach, the positive deviance approach. And in these 5 minutes, my world turned upside down. Because that's not the way I was trained to think. And he was talking about the diffusion of social innovations, not from the outside in, but he was talking about the diffusion of innovations from the inside out. For those of us who are trained in evidence-based practices, we have a practice and we say there's evidence to support that this would work, and now let's work with you to have you buy into our vision. Nothing wrong with it. I mean, I perfectly slept at night. I was making a good academic career. But what Jerry was saying is there is value not just in evidence-based practices, but there is value in practice-based evidence. Oh, what does that mean? What he was saying is if there's somebody out there in the community who does something differently, this is a variation of practice, and if that yields better outcomes within the community, within the context, then the problem has been solved by them. So if we can figure out what is it that they are doing, which is different, which is uncommon, then you can scale that, amplify that from the inside out. Are you with me? Do you get why my world was turned upside down? So these meetings are useful. After Jerry made his presentation, I just went and I said, Jerry, can I be your apprentice? And he laughed it off. He said, I read, you're a professor, you're this, you're distinguished, blah, blah. You've written X number of books. And I said, no, I'm really serious. I want to be your apprentice. And 2 weeks later, he gave me a call because a hospital CEO had invited him to work with the issue of hand hygiene in a big hospital in Connecticut. And positive deviance is a problem-solving approach. So now you ask the question, what's the problem in a hospital? Hand hygiene? I mean, how complicated can that be? And of course, then you realize that in the United States only, there are 4.5 million hospital-acquired infections and over 100,000 deaths, all under the radar. People go to the hospital, they get an infection, they pass away, or they have to stay in the hospital, another 10 days. And why does it happen? It happens because 80% of the time, whenever there's a contact between a healthcare provider and a patient, it carries the risk of infection transfer. And hand hygiene compliance rates in US hospitals, people who are trained to be doctors and nurses and therapists, is no more than 40% in any given hospital. So this is a big problem, right? But it's a complex problem. It's not just the technicality. I don't see that my hands are dirty. But if I'm a surgeon and I've scrubbed, and let's say I'm, doing, and my beeper beeps, and it's the missus, maybe, and you just, click it off, you really need to go and scrub all over again. Who has the temerity to tell the surgeon, Mr. Surgeon, you need to go scrub? People die because people cannot speak up. And 100,000 deaths each year. You get the idea? Complex problem. It's not a simple problem. It's a complex problem because there are hierarchies. It's a complex problem because we are in the midst of an important surgery. The context is such. You get the idea? He's already scrubbed. Complexity, behavior change. So anyway, So I became Jerry's apprentice, and he then asked me if I'd go to Uganda to work with the reintegration of child soldiers, which was a Save the Children project, go to Indonesia to work with sex trafficking, because there were many communities that were sending young girls in the entertainment or the hospitality industry, and we all know what that means. But then, of course, you can ask the question, are there some communities which have a very high rate of sending young girls? Are there some girls who come from very poor families, whom you would expect, who are not going? And if so, what explains that? Because they've solved the problem. You get the idea? In Uganda, in northern Uganda, with the Lord's Resistance Army, the conflict, almost 80,000 children were abducted, young girls mostly, taken to the bush, where they were used as sex slaves and porters and cooks, over a period, and then many of them became child spies, because children are not suspected as much, and then some transformed into being child soldiers. Complete brainwashing. And over a period of 10 years, some of these children escaped or were rescued. And now they come back to their communities, but they are not accepted. Why? Because you have served the enemy as a spy or a soldier. So the complex issue that we were looking into with Save the Children was, are there some young girls who have come back with 2 children of the enemy, but who are very well reintegrated? And if so, they are deviants because they are not the norm. They're positive because they've solved the problem. And the wisdom to solve the problem is there. They've solved it. Inside out. So, of course, the question is, what is it that they're doing? They must be doing something. And then how do you measure it also, right? So I became acutely aware doing these field-based projects. And Jerry passed away in 2008, just a month or two after I came back from Uganda and Indonesia. And I made a promise to him, I think I was telling Inga, when he had a stroke and was around for a day or two before he passed away, and I visited him. And I made a promise that I will do whatever I can do with the learnings that you have extended to me. And I, the next semester, began teaching a course on the positive deviance approach. And I've worked off and on with about 30 countries in about 50 different domains dealing with issues of rights, trafficking and rights, reintegration of children who are soldiers and their rights, to very... Maybe I'll mention a small little moment for me from Uganda about the power of this approach. As a researcher, we have our tools and methods. So if you're trying to understand how well these returned child soldiers have reintegrated, we may have a questionnaire, right? With several items. Maybe it's translated in the local language. Maybe it's developed along with, your local collaborators. And then somehow it is administered. A Likert scale, do you strongly agree? There's nothing wrong with that approach. I was trained in that. I'm very good at those processes. I can run LISREL and ANOVAs and multivariate statistics and regression and all that. But my world had changed completely because I knew we could not work with these complexities of reintegration by having a survey. And this is what I owe to Jerry. So we began to do what we call participatory sketching. We gave these young girls colorful pencils. In fact, we were short of pencils, so we broke the pencil in two and sharpened it so it became two, so that they could have a little more color. Many of them had never held a pencil in their lives before because they were abducted at age 7 and now they were 18. And there was fear of holding a pencil. But we didn't want them to write. The question we asked was very simply, how has your life changed in the past few months or a year that you have been back in your communities? Yeah, and this was to get a sense of their process of reintegration. And one of the things that we began to observe, you would love this, I think Chambers would really like this, was we began to see, we saw many things in their sketches, but one of the things that we saw was a tree around their house. And, it's a tree around the house, what's so special? And then as you encouraged, as you gave them voice, as you gave them the means of producing knowledge based on their visualization, this is beyond textocentrism. We researchers are so text-focused now. We think that if it's not written, and if it's not coded in a written format, and God forbid if it's not published, and God forbid if it's not published and peer-reviewed, it is not knowledge. We suffer from that textocentrism, and we don't even think about it. So here we are, handing over the means of producing knowledge to the ones who can produce knowledge. And we began to see a house and a tree. Okay, after the 8th abductee coming and talking about this, I said, talk about the tree. And she says, in a Choli culture of northern Uganda, the worst curse that you can give to anybody, the worst ill will that you can inflict on anybody is to say, you are so impure that not even a tree would grow around your house. Whew. My God. Then we see birds. Birds. Yeah. There's only birds flying over your hut and over the tree if you have enough food to eat. Which means I'm taking care of myself. And their insurance and their savings bank are packets of groundnuts that they've harvested. I have 3.5 packets this big. That's their insurance. So if they don't have food, they can trade it for a chicken. Or you get the idea? My God. Talk about resilience. Talk about measures of what security means to them. And then they talk about the clothesline. You just see a clothesline from the house to the tree, and there are some clothes, and those are really colorfully. And then somebody begins to talk about it. When I was in the bush and I was abducted, the only thing that I had was what I was wearing, my skirt. And when 2 years later I delivered my child, I tore half of my skirt and had to carry my baby around it. Look now. I have 3 dresses, and my child has 4. Their measure of their own self-worth and identity in the context of what is a very hostile community, who looks at them as social pariahs. Because the Lord's Resistance Army, many of you may know this, had this brutal ritual that once they abducted a child, the next day they would come back to the child's village, put a machete on the child's head, give them a gun, and have them kill their loved ones. And why? Because they wanted to sever the very last connection that they had. So here are these girls. And then, of course, this took the cake when it comes to reintegration. Tree, right? I've already talked about it. Some of them had something under the tree. And, as these narratives began to surface, one of them said, yeah, I've got a mat under the tree. What does it mean? In a Choli culture, if you have a mat under a tree outside your house, it means it's an open public invitation to anybody in the community to come and sit and have a cup of tea. And then you say, could there be a better measure of reintegration? that you have put a mat outside your home and you are openly inviting somebody to come and have a cup of tea? Okay. I'm talking about this because completely blew my mind about the way we do things as researchers, as interventionists, how we collect data, whose reality matters, how do we measure, how do we evaluate. And that's the reason why I owe a big debt of gratitude to Jerry. Do I have a few more minutes?
Yeah.
Or I'm doing okay? How am I doing?
You have 15 minutes left.
No, 15 minutes to a professor? Okay.
Or we jump into whichever.
Okay. Let me, if you would, with your permission, tell you how my worldview has turned. Yeah? That's important. I'll tell you 3 stories. I'm sorry, I don't have a PowerPoint, PowerPoint. That's the closest I'll get to PowerPoint, sorry. But I'll tell you 3 stories. And I want you to pay attention to these stories because they're important stories for me. But maybe you'll pay attention to them. This is the shift. Inga, how tall are you?
163, maybe.
And see, she doesn't even need to say I'm 163 centimeters. Right? She just says 163. Because we all understand, there's a common understanding. If I had asked this question of an Inga in India, she would say I'm 1.63. And we would all know what that means, no? If you were in my United States of America, you would say something like, I'm 5'4", or something like that. And we will all know it's 5 feet, 4 inches. No? Does anybody know how tall? We've got a certain president in the White House now, but there was another president in the White House over 150 years ago whose name was Abraham Lincoln. Do you know how tall he was? Anybody? Take a guess.
6'7".
He was a tall man, no? He was 6'4.5". Okay? But he always wore a 7-inch hat. So he was about 7 feet. You can actually see his hat in the Smithsonian in Washington, and you'll see that it is worn out towards the right-hand flap. Why? Because he would tip his hat. You know, if you were walking and you'd see him, he'd flip his hat. He would acknowledge you. So Lincoln was a tall man, and the story goes, I'll make the story fast. In Gettysburg battlefield, because he was, presiding over the Civil War, and he visited battlefields because he wanted to feel as a leader the gravity of the consequences of the decisions he was making, right? And, his famous address in Gettysburg, 172 words, if you go to the Washington Mall, Lincoln Memorial there enshrined, and where he's talking about here are those who've given all they had so that a union could survive. And so at Gettysburg, a soldier walks up to him and salutes the commander-in-chief. No, he's the president, he's the commander-in-chief. And then, extends his hand only to realize that Mr. Lincoln is tall and I am here. So he says, "Oh, Mr. President, you're tall. How tall are you?" His answer, and this is a shift, not 6'4.5", not 194. His answer, "Son, like you, I'm tall enough that my feet reach the ground." Okay? I want you to think about that. Here's a president, commander-in-chief, talking to a soldier, a citizen, to a apparently shorter man. And what is his response? "Son, like you, tall enough that my feet reach the ground." Positive deviance approach is not about you being the commander-in-chief or the president or being tall or having stripes. It is acknowledging that the wisdom to solve the problem lies in the common ground. You with me? It's a very important shift. Just embodied in that sentence. It's relational. Son, like you, it's familial. Tall enough. Humility. Okay. Second story. You ready? The flip. Why it flipped my world upside down. It's a story from Mother Teresa. Now, I know she got the Nobel Peace Prize, not very far away from where we are. I've been to the City Hall. 3 weeks ago, I was in Mother Teresa's home in Calcutta. I had a correspondence relationship with her for 11 years. We exchanged dozens of letters. I was in her presence multiple times. I collect stories about Mother Teresa. And this story is an important story for the way we frame and look at our world. Mother Teresa arrives in Washington in 1974. At that time, we had another crooked president. His name was Dick Nixon. And Watergate, Vietnam War, all kinds of things were happening. And Mother arrives in Washington, and people walk up to her, like, Mother, we're so happy you're here. Tomorrow we are having a march in Washington, and we'd like for you to march with us. And she says, my child, what is the march about? And she says, Mother, we are marching against the Vietnam War. And Mother, we'd like for you to march with us. And now there's silence. And if you're with Mother Teresa and there's silence, she's thinking, you're probably not going to get the answer you want. She's not going to buy into your sense of what you want. So somebody says, so Mother, will you march with us? And she says, my child, if you're going to have a march in Washington against the Vietnam War, I am so sorry, my child. But, my child, if you were to choose to have a march in Washington for peace, I will be the first to lead. Now, I want you to pay attention to this. We are problem solvers. If you're a problem solver, what's the first thing you go for? What's the problem? Right? And if you begin by asking what's the problem, you begin by asking what's not working. And you begin by looking at the gaps, the deficits, right? Knowledge gaps, attitude gaps, practice gaps. And I was a master at doing needs assessment and gap analysis. Why? Because now with your expertise, you can fill those gaps. Right? This is missing. What is Mother Teresa telling us? If you pay attention to this story. She's saying it's okay. There's nothing wrong in marching against the war. She has no quarrels with that. Like nothing wrong in being 6 feet, 4.5 inches tall. You could have given that response, that's fine. What she's saying is, you should always ask the question, what are you for? We are against sexual discrimination. We are against the abuse of children. That's fine. But because we get sucked into the problem, what's missing, who's at the highest risk, that's all important. But she's saying, what are you for? Instead of what are the deficits, what are the assets? Instead of what is not working, have you asked the question, what's working? So she, positive deviance, gives us this. Do I have a minute? 2? 1 minute, okay. Fast. So she's basically saying, ask for what's working if you want to solve what you're against. You with me? Third story has to be a Gandhi story. Mahatma Gandhi, he always traveled by train in India as the father of the Indian nation, like a poor man. And he didn't travel first class, didn't travel second class, he traveled third class. And then the question was asked, Bapu, father, why do you travel third class? And his response, always the same. I travel third class because, as you know, there is no fourth class. whose reality counts. Putting the last first, putting the first last. Chambers. India would not have gotten its independence the way it did had it not been for Gandhi taking the perspective of the fourth class. You can take these three stories and craft a positive deviance question. I believe that we grow in the direction of the questions we ask. We rarely ask the question, are there children under the age of 5 who come from the poorest of poor families, fourth class, for that issue, who are well nourished, which is what you're for, Mother Teresa. We rarely ask the question, are there young girls who came back, who lived in the bush for 10 years, who've come back with 2 children, who are social pariahs, but who, so you see the fourth class, all the odds, but who are thriving? If you ask those questions, you'll be at a different place. So participation, evidence-based practice, all that, yes. But these flips are highly critical. So my world was turned upside down because Jerry gave me another way to think. Believe, act. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very inspirational talk. Very useful to flip the way we see the world. I will ask the panelists to just come and sit, along with you.
Me too.
Står det? Så. Så har vi Norad.
When we were working put together this conversation, I was thinking we have a lot of Norwegian NGOs who apply participatory methods. And it will be very interesting to hear their experiences. So we're very lucky to have Atle Kauros, who works with the Norwegian Church Aid. He's a senior advisor within Peace Building. And we have Norad Nilsen from Save the Children. He's the leader for the child rights units. And I think those two perspectives will provide a lot of shed some interesting light on what Arvind has been saying. Lutgard Lennartz has 15 years of academic experience. She's worked extensively with ethnographic methods, particularly in Ethiopia. So she has a lot of practical background on participatory methods. Welcome. I will first ask Atle to share some of NCA's experiences when it comes to participatory methods. When we spoke, you mentioned, for example, local innovation as something you work with, working with religious leaders to guide social behavior change. I'm very interested to hear more, and I've also asked both of you to reflect a little bit on if we know that participatory methods are very effective, what can we as a donor do to facilitate greater use of such methods? Thank you.
Okay, if I'm to start, it was very interesting, very rewarding and motivating to listen to you. So thank you for what you shared. In Norwegian Church Aid, we work, I think, closely up to what you're saying, but we have a lot to learn as well. We do have a lot of these meeting points with the communities. Our work is, I think, very participatory. Community conversations is a must. Our planning is with the communities. And we have community-based projects and programs. And we also have expressions like survivor and community-led responses, like in Palestine and Gaza, where community groups are finding their ways and we are supporting. And we are leading the cluster group in Gaza. And the first person we sent in, actually, is the contact person between us and these community groups to learn from them what we should do. As an example, we worked a few years ago in India. We don't do that now. Together with an organization that was called Interfaith Coalition for Peace, trying to get minority groups more engaged in related to right issues and engagement in the community. And we know that in the higher civil services, the number of people from minority groups were very few compared to the majority community. And we wanted to understand why. So questions were asked. The few that were there said, I was encouraged. Someone told me that I could. And I had someone to consult, and I made it. So a program was started to invite people, youth from this group, to say, you can do it. We can give you some counseling. But this is also for you. It's not only for the majority. With that little effort, then the percentage spiraled. In Ethiopia, since 2018 and 19, we have seen a lot of community conflicts, intercommunal conflicts, where ethnicity and religion was an element. It was difficult to do something about it. But then it was possible to bring religious actors together from all the different faith groups to jointly move into these areas. They were also inter-ethnic, and say that, hello, this is not what we teach. This is not what our holy book says. We are all creations of God. We are equally valuable. We should not kill each other. So what people thought that elites has told them, that the people on the other side of the road were enemies, was not right, and it was corrected by people they had that they could trust. So over 50% of these conflicts, the first responders were religious actors, and then mediators and others, police and military, could move in. Another element goes back some years. We don't use so much the term, as you said also, deviance approach or deviance, but early 2000 we worked on HIV/AIDS, and at that time this expression was there. And we had a program in Ethiopia that also developed into an FGM, an early marriage program, where we were wondering how could we stop FGM. And then the youth said that we should just start protesting. I'll go to my mother and say that no one should cut my body. And when because the mothers were the ones to say that you have now to be circumcised because the marriage is coming, you should be prepared. And this led to an advocacy program, and then they wondered, who could say that this is wrong? Again, religious actors. They could say that the Bible, the Quran, doesn't say that. You shouldn't do that. And it ended up with becoming the government in Ethiopia adopting a family law that prohibited FGM and early marriage. So these are elements. But sometimes it's a tough work to meet with the community and draw out those things that we should work with them too. They do a lot of it themselves. But what should be our NCA program with these communities? But I think we have some tools that is helping us. The whole HDP nexus, triple nexus thing that we're talking about these days has a strong element of community participation, local participation. The people who are the targets for the assistance should be the ones deciding with the resourced NGOs what the shared outcomes should be. There is an opportunity to develop that. And then we have the whole women, peace and security engagement that we all are engaged in. I think bringing women to the forefront in the development and humanitarian action line has changed so much, because they confront this positive deviation, and I represent this positive deviation in a remarkable way. And then finally, funding is a crucial thing. I think if we're going to do the things that you, Professor, were mentioning here, Arvind, we need flexible funding. We need a little bit of time. We cannot start this conversation and get the ideas before we get the money, because we don't know what to do. So there needs to be some flexibility where we can know that we have some resources, so we with some confidence can go and disturb the community, and we will get the ideas, and then we can design the programs after the ownership and accountability is established with the local communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Message received, and as Brynjar said, we will immediately act upon it, of course, which I cannot promise. But
let me just say that this Ethiopia example was a joint program with Save the Children.
Yeah.
Is the mic on now? Yeah, perfect. No. Try again. No. I think he's coming. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. No, first of all, thanks to Inge Dahl and Norad for inviting to this very interesting conversation, and also to you, Professor Singhal or Arvind.
Arvind, please, yeah. Arvind. It's good.
It was very inspiring to listen to you, and like Arne said, it was interesting when I started to read up on your work, because it turns out that he's been working with Save the Children colleagues for decades.
I have been.
But honestly, I haven't heard a phrase before you wrote that email to me. So I guess it's a picture about the different trends in terminology in the aid business. So it comes and goes.
It comes and goes.
But the point is that we are doing a lot of the same. We try to do a lot of the same approach that you're talking about, but we don't call it positive deviance. And I think it's touching upon some of the key issues in the aid discourse today. So obviously, and I think Liv, linked it to locally led, human right-based approach. I think it can be linked to innovation, innovation. Also a little bit about effectiveness in aid, perhaps. So there's so many approaches, and difficult to find one approach to this discussion in a way. So my comments will be about how we see this in Save the Children. Some examples without bragging too much, and perhaps pointing to a couple of barriers and challenges and the solutions I see. And also because I'm from Save the Children, we have a right-based approach. So I also want to sort of flag the importance of child participation.
Yes.
Links with what you said, because you said that participation is also about including the most vulnerable people. Very often that's children, because they don't have the right to vote and they have limited resources to influence the discussion, right? So we really need to make a push for getting their voice into the picture. And it's not just because it's a smart idea that identifies solutions like you're talking about, Arvind, but it's also a fundamental right. It's Article 12 in the Convention, and all of us have to oblige to that. So that's just not a question. And I think it's a requirement from Norad too. But also we see that children understand the process of being involved in determining the interventions they are actually receiving as very meaningful as well. So on an individual level, it feels meaningful. It has a lot of different outcomes for children. It can have learning outcomes, personal development outcomes, but also social outcomes. They can meet people and have fun. And it's also worth mentioning, I think. But I think all of us in the room have experienced how to balance this. I don't know, you didn't say so much about it, but on the one hand, we have our own plans of strategy. We have the donor requirements, limited budgets, and lack of knowledge about the context, perhaps. And Norad, on your part, I guess you have the political steer and the budget limitations. And that needs to be balanced with a need for flexibility on the ground and listening to local advice. So that balance is actually difficult in practice very often. So I have to be very honest about that. The examples. We are lucky enough to be one of the plus partners of Norad, so we have that, predictability to a certain extent that we have a framework agreement and we have very good chances to get a new one renewed after that. So building on that, we were able to do quite large consultation processes when we were entering a new framework. So I think we had consultations with child groups and civil society partners in all the 13 countries. Maren, was it like more than 1,000 children invited? So like we very simply put, it was sort of twofold. So first we talked about what are your challenges? What are your main concerns? And they came up with violence at school, early marriage, bullying came up quite strongly, didn't it? Things we didn't think about before. And they also, in a second round, they suggested solutions on the local level. So how can we make the school a respectful and safe place? How can we increase the knowledge about child rights in the community? And the same we did with local organizations. So we invited 70 of them to consult. I think it's worth mentioning that they are not always agreeing. They are interest organizations, so there's a lot of disagreement. So we cannot simply just translate every word into practice. We need to bring it on and to consider it, in a sort of the co-design of the project. So that's a good example of proposal, co-creation, participation, but it's not representative because not all donors are giving us that kind of security and flexibility. On the program side, I have so many things I want to say, and you stole one of them, the Ethiopia example. But let me mention an interesting case in Laos where we had funding. There was a strengthening civil society project, and we invested in setting up a network of civil society organizations and created a small sub-granting structure under that. So small organizations were able to apply for funding through the project. And we created a very simple proposal format and a very simple reporting format. And the network decided who they were granting. And that was also very interesting to see some of the ideas that came up. And not all of them succeeded so well, I have to say, but a few of them really picked up traction. So very interesting. And I think another example for me is in Nepal, where we have an education program. Because of the flexibility of Norad, we were able to sort of co-design with school management and teacher and parent associations. The teacher and parents discuss together. And I think perhaps they're influenced by the aid terminology, so they came up with all these small concepts and they gave them names. So they made this concept called parent-teacher. So parents were invited to stay a full day in school and assist the teacher. And that they helped out, but I think the main purpose was to create understanding about the school daily life among parents. And there's a few examples, and just a promising trend also is the rising climate investments that's coming up. One of the leading approaches within climate is the locally led adaptation. So it means that local communities have more direct access to funding and design over their interventions. Perhaps challenge. Oh, sorry, I must have spoken like 4.
You could wrap up, yeah.
Okay, I need to put this into 3 sentences. Challenges. You said it, Arna. Very often when we apply for funding, we need detailed plans up front with log frames, don't activity level, how to measure. So it's difficult to adjust that along the process. Also, we have to report very strictly on pre-designed indicators very often. It's calls for standardization and very difficult to change. And also the last point I think you actually covered really well. It has to do with epistemology. So what do we know what we know? Whose knowledge is valid to inform development investments? And it has been top-down Western-centric. We need to open for different knowledge forms.
Yeah. Thank you.
That was quick, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Those are really interesting examples. I think so many interesting topics are coming up here. So, Lutgard, over to you. When we were interviewing people and trying to figure this out, you said to me at one point, but Inger, we know this. This is common knowledge in the literature that participatory approaches lead to better results and more sustainable results. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? And do you have some reflections on what you've heard and also on what are the barriers for increasing the use of participatory methods?
Great, thank you. I'm very happy to see all of you, and very happy to get opportunity to talk about this topic, and to hear you talking live now, because we had earlier meetings online. Very interesting comments and examples from you as well. I got to know participatory approaches more from the agricultural perspective, and I've also mostly worked on that and on natural resource-based management participation. What I learned during my academic work is that participation as a concept started in the 1950s in the US, but really gained traction in development aid in the late 1970s. And then within agricultural development, and a lot of development aid at that time was still based mainly on agriculture and drilling water holes and so forth. As Arvind also mentioned already, Robert Chambers, whose first book was Put the Farmer First, or Farmer First, simply said. So it was also about the whole research system existing of for example, getting improved varieties of maize, and then we know now which maize should be grown in Malawi, so let's get it to the farmer now, and what do we do? And then, as Liv mentioned already, participation has two sides of it. Initially, maybe it was mostly seen as instrumental, like we need to do participation so that we reach our goals. Or as one policymaker in Ethiopia once told me in an interview was, we need to participate the farmer. And I was like, what? And then it has, as Liv also mentioned, the intrinsic value. And in Norway it has both, but mainly we've luckily shifted more to the intrinsic value of participation as a human rights. So that's very good. So what I've been wondering about, indeed, so if you see in the field of agriculture and development aid, it started already in the late 70s, at least in the 80s, so it's actually half a century that participatory development has been researched on, and that research indeed shows that you get more long-lasting, more sustainable results if you include the community from the start. And there's been a lot of research that Liv also told about different types of participation, because often organizations come in and do participatory workshops and think like, look how well we've done, but they're not there the next morning when 5 of the women show up with a black eye because their husbands were not so happy about their participation in that workshop the day before. So genuine participation, there's a lot of literature about that. I'm sure all of you're here because you have an understanding of what it is. But indeed, why is it that half a century later we're still here discussing it and still talking about how can we do better? And you both mentioned several constraints already, and I think it's about the boundaries that we have to, every individual has to, in a creative way, steer his or her life within. Is that correct English? I'm not sure. But during my research, I focused a lot on what you hinted at, that the Ethiopian state set certain boundaries, or willingly, unwillingly comes up with certain incentives for people to not participate or participate in certain programs or certain measures that are intended to protect natural areas, for example. Or the conflict between ethnic groups, that actually the state is indirectly reinforcing those by how they set up participatory processes. So you have the whole setup of institutional boundaries that people need to navigate within. And then you have obviously the setup from the donor to the ones who receive the funds to work, and please work in a participatory way and do genuine participatory approaches. But please mention them in the log frame, can you already document the results in a year from now, please, so that we can then. And then now I've only moved to Norad 2 years ago, and I've been on maternity leave 1 year. But now I'm like on this side, and I see also, like we got yesterday or this morning, the tildelingsbrev, so the letter from the government on what the funds are and how we're supposed to use them. And then we have, of course, all the strategies, and we have, and there is all this reporting, and governments get re-elected or not. So they want to show what they have achieved. So please, if we could document good results before the new election campaign starts, that would be great. So that's what at all these levels of how aid, or let's call it aid, that's the wrong wording, but development cooperation is set up, both locally, and then I've only talked about governmental structures, but of course you have also the local structures and so on. There are always these institutional, social, but also bureaucratic boundaries that people, communities, being the community of Norad, or the community of civil society organizations in Norway, or local communities in the south, they have to navigate within those boundaries. So that's my thought after hearing all this. And I also wonder, Arvind, if you maybe could enlighten us a bit about maybe how positive deviance as an approach is better at navigating within those boundaries and still reach good results.
Good segue, thanks.
Okay, is my voice coming through?
Yes.
It's so nice to put a microphone on. You feel like a rock star. I thank my colleagues for their insight and their wisdom. And of course, we recognize and acknowledge the barriers that there are, whether it's a requirement for a log frame or whether it's pre-designed, pre-packaged, missions and visions, and nothing wrong with it, like nothing wrong with being 6 foot 4.5 inches tall and saying it, nothing wrong with being against the war, nothing wrong in traveling first class. I do want to say, and I'm putting myself in the mix, the biggest barrier to participation is us. Now I'm just putting myself in the bullseye, and that is because, and if you go back to the 3 stories, and which is what my world turned upside down, what Jerry was telling me is if you want to do development work, your expertise is in relinquishing your expertise. So I am the barrier, when I begin to process things in a certain way. And he's not saying relinquish your expertise always. He's just saying relinquish it temporarily to ask a different question. That wisdom is distributed. Let's believe that the wisdom is distributed. Truly believe. What Mother Teresa is telling us is that we cannot get away from a problem framework. That's the way we are trained to think. The barriers are here. We get in the way. What Gandhi is telling us is that we are so in tune with the language of best practices, of evidence-based practices, that we cannot release ourselves from looking at the worst-case scenario. We cannot release ourselves from. So I'm responding, I'm listening to all of you, and I listen to me. But I think fundamentally, we are sitting here on stage with microphones, and you're there in rows and columns. But truly, if we believe in participation, we haven't designed the right space, I would say. Yeah, because here we are at experts. There's even a podium. I've got the microphone. You have no voice. You're listening, but it's in. So these things are completely taken as normal. We have a narrative of participation which doesn't put us in the picture. Isn't that what's wrong with that? it's okay to feel like an expert or a rock star. But I do fundamentally, this is what Jerry did for me, or this is what your question was. What does the positive deviance approach, how does it differ? And our experience has been in the projects that I've worked on. The first project was Vietnam, 1990, childhood malnutrition. And Vietnam solved its malnutrition program, thanks to Save the Children, Jerry, Monique, and hundreds of thousands of people in Vietnam in 8 years with local resources, not with biscuits, protein bars, from Scandinavia with warehouses and, that whole machinery, that whole industry, but with their own shrimps and crabs and snails and shellfish and peanuts and soybeans. And that only happened because you asked a different question. Is there somebody who here, against all odds, has solved the problem? And if they have, the wisdom is here. And now let's identify that wisdom and ask them how it can be scaled. But the reason I'm talking about Vietnam is because the two most important aspects of the Vietnam program, which is positive deviance, is what we call, number one, and this was a study that was done 5 years after Save the Children had left, after this program was wound up. And this study was called the sibling effect. And then you say, well, what's the sibling effect? So there were children who were malnourished, who then were well-nourished, as being part of this PD inquiry, with people finding local resources. But then they had siblings later. Their brothers and sisters who came along a few years later. And that study showed that the siblings were well-nourished too. And sustainability. In 2015, some people returned back to Vietnam, and now we talk about the grandmother's effect. And then you say, what's the grandmother's effect? It'll be hard to capture in a log frame to have a project that's 20 years long, but you can certainly go back. Well, the mothers who at that time had children who were malnourished now are grandmothers. And so some of these practices and other practices continue. So I do think that we have to be compassionate to ourselves and to our positionalities, to the missions and visions, to the barriers, if you may, of international aid and administration, but also at the same time have some pockets of flexibility. I don't know whether it means pockets of funding. Some pockets where you can experiment joyfully. Because positive deviance is nothing but Sherlock Holmes. Somebody solved a problem who shouldn't have. Impossible. Poor mother whose children are well nourished. A young woman who was abducted, was in the bush, had 2 children, has come back, had pulled the trigger on 3 of her family members, and she's reintegrated, she's putting a map. Impossible. Impossible. Implausible. Improbable. This is no hypothesis testing. But, it's completely, we get in the way because of our training, because of the way we think. It's invisible to us. So I am basically saying, if we can create pockets, don't change the system. Positive deviance is not the only way. There's so many other ways. But if we can create little pockets of experimentation, I think we as an aid project, whether it's GIZ or whether it's Norad or it's CEDA or it's USAID, would be at a different place, which would be more humane, which would take more voice, which would work with the local wisdom, which already exists, and find a way to give its utterance. So that's sort of I have a dream, and that is my dream. That was Jerry's dream. And we can only continue to challenge ourselves to ask, where are we in the picture? And what is it that we must do, not what Norad or what, my boss or, my partners should do.
Thank you very much. So we did say that this was going to be a conversation, and we may not be so well set up for it, but at least I want to preserve some time for questions. I failed to introduce Ingjerd Thon Hagaset, who's sitting here at the front, who's working at University Inland and works on a positive deviance project with NAV here in Norway. So if you want to comment as well, please just raise your hand, and we have Ragnar will walk around with the mic, so if anyone wants to talk, there's one at the back there. And please state your organization and your name and sort of where you're coming from, so we get a little bit of a sense of who's in the room.
Inger, we can do Q&A. This is one way of using our time. And if we do Q&A, a few people will have questions and a few answers will be given. In my opinion, we can make it a little more participatory. Should we try it? Or we could just proceed with this?
Go ahead.
Okay.
It's your space.
Okay. You've given me a little space for experimentation? Okay, beautiful. Okay, I'd like all of you to rise. You too, yes. All of you were in the same space as where this conversation happened. And I'm sure some of you have questions, as I know, sir, you do. I know some of you have thoughts, some of you have comments, some of you have dilemmas, some of you are saying, oh, I don't know whether this is going to work. And what I'd like you to do is find yourself in a group of 4, okay, quickly. The only directive to you is to get in a group of 4, okay? Group of 4, it could be 3, it doesn't matter, group of 4. And here is what you're going to do. In this group of 4, each person gets 30 seconds, which means we will not take more than 2 minutes. Okay? And I'm not going to monitor those 30 seconds, but you have 3 or 4 sentences. Please go around, like have a talking stick, and each person can provide a comment, ask this is a question I have, this is a dilemma, yeah? And do it in 2 minutes. Beginning now. Go.
Også rettelegge på en måte enn litt bare det. Det er et flott skemaster veldig fint å prøve. Ja, så det er jo litt sånn uavhengig av hva det kommer inn og dette. Så det da du spurte om vi gjør det, så blir det sånn, hvordan kan vi få den dagen? Vi har dag. Ja, var det så det er i hvert fall sånn som jeg har som pleier å være mitt sånn innspill når vi tenker å snakke med kollegaer og sånn, er liksom hva får barna ut av den?
Jeg sitter og tenkte på jeg mener ja, det må være en forutsigbarhet i liksom hele det arbeidet der skal være selvkritisk. For det mind.
Take another 30 seconds. So if people have not gotten a chance, make sure that...
Ikke sant? Mer enn
Det er jo kunnskap. Altså, vi kan gjøre tenke deg. Hvordan får vi det til?
Hva er kunnskap?
Ikke sant? Ja.
Nei, jeg satt også. Men han hadde briller med også. Hele tanken var
As you can see, we have just unleashed more than 1 or 2 questions. And each person had an opportunity. Each person was invited to contribute. And each person was given a platform. So now we should go to each group, and each group gets only 2 sentences. Okay? Each group has to summarize. If there was a question, you can ask that question. But if there was a certain sentiment which the group wants to report to the bigger plenary, this is the value our group wants to contribute, they have that flexibility. And we'll begin with this group.
Ragna, kan du komme med mikrofonen?
Okay, and we'll do this quickly. This should not take more than 2 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Maren. I work with child participation in Save the Children. We discussed the bridge between the different types of evidence and knowledge, and the types of in the development sector, and also from at the political level, ask for evidence and to show that we do what we're supposed to do, we achieve our results, versus the evidence and whose knowledge
Beautiful.
on the ground. How can we capture that?
Okay, good. We pass it to the next group. And again, if there was a question that somebody posed, a burning question, maybe that'll come up.
My name is Despina from Norad.
Yep.
And we discussed interesting things, I believe, power dynamics that we usually don't take them into account when we do such interventions, discussions in our operations. We also discussed the importance of feedback mechanisms that are really inclusive, if I understood you correctly, rather than having the mechanism there and that's it.
Yeah.
And thirdly, a little bit how the flexibility is needed, not for the funding, but for sort of monitoring in the long term, because we're talking about mind change, behavior change, so these are not easy things to do in the short term.
We thank this group for their insights and contributions to the plenary. We go to the next group. You have 2 sentences.
Yes, my name is Wallaby and I am from SAI. And we just said that this was a very inspiring and refreshing discussion and conversation. And also we thought about how that we should be more mindful of how we sort of define different problems and sort of come with different solutions based on our own problem definitions.
Okay, terrific. Please pass it on to the other group. No questions have surfaced yet. That's okay.
Okay, my name is Rebecca Kazingachile from Point of Progress Malawi, but representing Spira here in Norway. I think we had a question and a bit of some contributions. So our question was that now that we're talking about the participatory approach, now how exactly do we make sure that these participatory approaches are actually transformative and not just performative? Because mostly the people are there in the communities, you invite them, they contribute, and they would say, oh yeah, we're a part of this, just because they want to tick on the box that, okay, we attended, we showed up, and we did this. But how exactly do we make sure that this is really for the transformation in the long run?
Beautiful. A question has been noted, and we will, if we have time, we will address it. Okay?
Thank you. My name is Tyler Dahlhauget. I work in Karibu Foundation. I was fortunate to write the guide that Liv spoke about at the beginning on participatory grant making in Norwegian.
Beautiful.
I have nothing else to say. You nailed it. That was the perfect question, and that was my question.
Terrific.
How do we ensure that power is actually moved and that it's not participant or it's not performative, especially when participation is a buzzword right
Beautiful. Now. Thank you. Appreciate a reinforcement of a question, which means it is a problem. You know, perceptually it is a problem. Yes.
Grouchy old cynic. From Scan Team. 40 years ago, spent 5 days in a participatory programming process where, among other things, we tried to identify the champions of change, maybe the positive deviance that you were talking about, but also the spoilers. That is, what I'm missing here is the reality of conflict in society. And the rent-seeking that always happens when you try to bring in something, and the fact that we are also bringing in a lot of our norms in terms of participation, who is supposed to participate, and what kinds of conflicts are we potentially creating in that. The second is the positive deviation. Is that really a structural feature of what we are learning and seeing, or is it a particularistic individual? The girls who integrate, is it because of some characteristics of themselves? In Mozambique, you have the same problem with the child soldiers. And there, a lot of the solutions were the traditional cleansing ceremonies that were carried out by village elders. So it was a structural, societal, local societal issue, and not something that was pushed onto the individual to become reintegrated.
Got it.
So
okay, perfect.
Anyway.
Well, there's a very beautiful, nuanced question in the comment. Yeah, terrific.
My name is Maja Nilsen, and I work in Norad. And we talked about that we often work very top-down, for example, with board meetings in the UN and so on. And we asked the question of how we can include more local perspectives and views and knowledge in those arenas.
Yeah, okay, good.
Hi,
yes,
Kathy
please.
Isaacson from Plan International.
Yes.
Our group basically talked about what others have touched on, discussed on stage also, and question maybe, is this a bit of a utopian way of thinking in terms of application to development cooperation with regards to funding, as was mentioned, the sort of the frameworks that we exist in. Is this possible? And then obviously what's required is a lot of time and a mindset shift, as was mentioned.
Mindset change, yeah. Okay, good. So there were a few questions. I don't think that any of these questions were really directed at me because there's a lot of wisdom here. Would anybody here like to address this very important question of performative versus actual, real, authentic participation? Anybody? Please. Wisdom lies in the common ground.
Here comes wisdom. I was thinking it depends on participation as a process, what happens in that process. So one can call it instrumental if you only think of what you want to get out of it, like what's the outcome. Whereas if the process, and keeping in mind I now tend to think about working with children. Of course. So if the process is done in a good, inclusive and open and honest way, I think that meeting can be very good in itself. And it can be very learningful and that can build your outcome in itself. So that is a way, at least for me, to think in terms of it's not necessary. This isn't instrumental if we do it right, independent on what I hope to achieve. Yeah.
And I'd just say, because professors are supposed to provoke, what's wrong with being instrumental? Okay. The other question would be, what's wrong in having a utopian vision? I mean, if there's something wrong with it, let's talk about it. But anyway, there was another wonderful nuanced question coming from this group, which was, maybe this girl does this because she has certain personality traits, and unless there is a systemic policy, this thing, really, does this make any sense? Anybody would like to address this issue or respond to it?
Yeah, I would.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, you gave the example of child soldiers in northern Uganda.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
See, I relinquish my expertise.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the example of child soldiers in northern Uganda. And I remember I used to work for World Vision. I now work for Red Cross.
Oh, yeah.
And the World Vision supported a group of women, former child soldiers. And I think, I'm not sure if it's about individual personality, because this particular locally led group, they were strong because they were many. And so it's that whole thing about, going directly to the source seeing what works for them and supporting them. So I think it's bigger than just individual personality.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else who'd like to respond to this beautiful question? Because the wisdom is here.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please, sir.
I
Please.
have talked a lot. I was thinking about, I don't know if it was a question or point from you, but the point that we are interfering as aid community in discourses that's quite controversial in local communities. And it's easy for us to say that that lady who is against early marriage is a positive deviant. But we are qualifying that as positive. It's not possible, perhaps, to make that argument straightforward. So in a way, the methodology is sort of aiming at evidence of positive behavior.
Yes.
But isn't that like a moral judgment also? And is it also a strategic approach to ally with someone who can say what we think? And how do we balance that?
Okay. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Any other comments or questions? There some may have arisen. And we've taken 10 minutes and we didn't do one Q&A, but I hope this was a different process that was employed. And hopefully everybody had an opportunity. I do have a closing thought, but you go ahead.
I just had a question to actually the representative from Point of Progress. I didn't catch your name. But one thing that I've been curious about is sort of the power dynamics between the local NGOs who have a very important job in doing that community outreach. And I think for many people, it's a big part of their identity. If you think about your field workers, how easy would it be for a field worker to completely relinquish their expertise, as Arvind mentioned, and take that very humble approach? If you could reflect on that, it would be very useful.
Okay, beautiful. My position is relinquish it temporarily.
Could she respond?
Oh, sorry. Yes, please do. Please do. Please do.
I think maybe for now I would say maybe more relatability with the people in the local communities, because I feel like it's more of the dependency on the donor expectations of, let's say, what is it exactly that they want. So it's the people following that more than the actual outcome or things they're supposed to do. Yeah, so I think there should be what is it that the people in the communities really want. Yeah. I'm not sure if that answers.
Yeah, Inya, do you have a comment?